Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Khalil. I'm the Communications Manager at ECA. I'm purely administrating the webinar platform today, so I'll be in the background. Very sorry for the slight delay in starting today. Some network issues that are hopefully now resolved. Welcome to today's ECA Learning Zone webinar with CompEx, the Hazardous Areas Training Specialists. Your ECA presenter today is our very own Senior Technical Manager, Gary Parker. From CompEx, we have Adam Montgomery and Paul Hague with us today, who Gary will introduce properly in just a moment. Today, we hope you come away with a better understanding of what is and what isn't a hazardous area, what you need to do to work safely in hazardous areas, and having the correct qualifications, training, and insurance in place. We do have a Q&A today. You should see a question mark button on your screen now. Please do make use of this throughout the session, and we will answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of today's webinar. And finally, a reminder that today's session is being recorded, and the full replay will be available on ECA's YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/ECA Live. We've also got all our previous webinar recordings up there for you to watch. And final thing from me, if you are an ECA member, do also remember to log in to the technical area of our website, where you can access our industry-leading technical support, guidance notes, editable certificates, FAQs, and exclusive access to our technical helpline. Just go to eca.co.uk/technical for more about that. And that's enough from me. I hope you enjoy today's presentation. And over to you, Gary.
Bro, thanks, Omar. Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully you're lucky enough to get some sunshine. ECA members work across a huge range of different industries and undertake all different types and manner of electrotechnical work. And many of the projects that our members work in and stray into often have locations where, although the work is mainstream, the location itself and what's in there, the processes and the equipment and the products, can present issues, and one such issue is the big risk of explosion. Now, a lot of contractors think this is related only to petrol stations or oil rigs or the like, but it isn't. And this sort of risk can come from lots of different sources, some of which are quite surprising. And anybody who's worked in a large factory or environment where there's paint or storage of paint or spraying may well have strayed into hazardous areas, sometimes without knowing it. So today's webinar, we're really lucky to have a couple of guys from CompEx, Paul and Alan, to talk to us about hazardous areas, highlight some of the risks and what members should be looking for, where to stop with their concerns, and if they've got any issues, who to ask and what to do, and also how to make sure they're working safely, both for themselves, for their insurances, for their clients, and also stay within the confines of the law. Afternoon, Paul. Afternoon, Alan. You all right?
Yes, thank you. All good.
Yeah, afternoon, Gary. Afternoon, everyone.
You're good. Hopefully, you guys are keeping nice and busy. I know that we spoke the other day, and it seems that you're finding all sorts of inquiries are coming your way of late.
Yes, yeah, as ever, from all over the world.
Brilliant. Yeah, I suppose it's fair to say CompEx aren't just a UK only entity, are you? You've got sites throughout the world, effectively, haven't you?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you guys. I think Paul, is it yourself who'll be giving the presentation today?
It will, yeah. So technology all permitting, obviously I'll share my screen if that's all right, Gary.
Absolutely. And just for the guys watching, if anybody wants to ask a question, if you drop it in the question mark where Omar said, we'll try and pick up the questions at the end as well. All right. I'll turn my camera off and leave you guys to it now. Best of luck.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, can everybody see my screen? Is that working?
I can see it here, Paul. Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, today's presentation and talk is just really around about explosive atmospheres, and obviously just raising awareness for ECA members into some of the hazards that you may experience and some of the ways you can make sure that you can work safely in those areas and you've got the right training and competency to work safely. So we will start off with a bit of a basics. From our point of view, you know, we look at the fire triangle, and in simple terms, everything we do is broadly based upon this fire triangle. As you can see there, we've got the three elements, and we've got oxygen we need, and it's represented by the air that we breathe. We need an ignition source, and that's shown there through heat, and we need some sort of fuel. Now, in most instances, we can do little about the oxygen in the air that we obviously, so we can't do anything about that. We can do something about the fuel. We can ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that a release of a flammable material is either eliminated or reduced, and we'll come into that in a bit more later on. What we can do, though, and that's both through CompEx, through the standards that we work through, from the legal requirements you're required to work under, and obviously the actions you do on site, what we can do is control the ignition sources, and that's what we'll be concentrating on here. So when we talk about things like intrinsic safety, increased safety, flame proof, these will hopefully start to mean something to you in relation to how we can control ignition sources and ultimately remove one of those elements from the fire triangle and stop a fire or explosion from occurring. So a bit about the legislation from a UK perspective. The main real two that we work under is the Dangerous Substances and Explosive Atmosphere Regulations, also known as ECA. That came in July 2003, and it looks at things like risk assessments for areas which are potentially dangerous from the point of view of dangerous substances, explosive atmospheres, identification of ignition sources, the control measures you will introduce to either eliminate or control the risk in those areas. It also looks at the requirement for area classification, and we'll talk about that later on. It also looks at if you've got an area which is classified, then obviously you've got to make sure that you've got the correct equipment in those areas and that equipment is installed correctly. It also makes sure that you've got the signage so people are aware of the areas that we're working in and those areas which do contain a potentially explosive atmosphere. For those who are interested, if you do a quick Google search, other search engines are available. Then if you look at type in HSE and ACOP, ACOP and L138, then you'll come up with the approved code of practice. That's a free issue, by the way, from the HSE, and that gives you a lot of information in relation to safe working in explosive atmospheres. The other bit of information we've got there is a bit of a mouthful. We call it the EPS regs, and that's the Equipment and Protective Systems for Use in Potentially Explosive Atmosphere Regulations. That is actually, for those who may know or be familiar with the term ATEX, obviously we're out of Europe now. However, the requirements has always been from a UK statutory point of view, the EPS regulations, and that is all about the equipment that is in these areas. So this piece of legislation covers a manufacturer of equipment that can be safely used in these hazardous areas, and we'll talk about some of these terms as we go through the presentation. Just a bit, sometimes get asked about UKCA. UKCA obviously is replacing the CE mark. In general terms and from a point of view of equipment selection, okay, UKCA would not have a massive impact. You still have to choose equipment correctly by what we call the ATEX category. And again, if you look at things like the ACOP or come on a CompEx course, some of these terms will mean something to you. But ultimately, what you've got there is DCIA. That is all about the user, the site, the person, and the EPS regs is all about the equipment that goes in those areas. Just quickly also about the electricity at work regulations, and for those who know large sites where you've got COMA, control of major accident hazards, the electricity at work regulations does actually include a section in there about protective systems for use in explosive atmospheres. I think it uses the term to take note into account the protection of equipment from diverse or hazardous environments, including flammable or explosive substances, including gases, vapors, and dusts. So even electricity work regulations does cover from a point of view of EX or explosive atmospheres. From a point of view of COMA, well, COMA, obviously, control and measure accident hazards. You will be familiar with a COMA site if you ever walked past a refinery or drove past a chemical site. These tend to be the major accident sites. And again, under general duties, it does state every operator must take all measures necessary to prevent major accidents and to limit their consequences for human health and the environment. So it's a general catch-all statement, really, but it does include the facts that, you know, you should do everything you can, obviously, to ensure that the accidents aren't going to happen, and obviously by the protective measures we will go through as we go through this presentation. A little bit about some of the terms I've been using. So what do we talk about when we look at the term explosive atmosphere? Okay, well, it's a mixture with air that under atmospheric conditions of flammable substances in the forms of gas, vapor, dust, fibers of flyings, which after ignition permit self-sustaining flame propagation, which is effectively an explosion. So what we're saying there ultimately is we've got a location where we've had a release of material, obviously being flammable. It could be a gas, it could be vapor, it could be a dust, and I tend to find that people don't realize some of the hazards associated with dusts or fibers or flyings. But ultimately, after ignition, it sustains itself, and this is where you get an explosion. Okay. The hazardous area is simply an area where that explosive gas atmosphere or dust cloud, in the case of combustible dusts, is or it may be expected to be present in terms of quantities such that we have to have requirements for equipment that goes in those areas, and that equipment goes in those areas has precautions for construction, installation, and use. So, and we'll talk about the types of equipment later. In terms of those hazardous areas, they're split into either you have a hazardous area or a non-hazardous area, and those hazardous areas are split into what we call zones. Okay. And these are based upon the frequency and duration of the explosive atmosphere. Okay, so and we'll talk about those in a bit. In relation to the standards, you'll see at the top there, we talk about IEC 60079-10-1 and 10-2. They are the two standards which we refer to when we're looking at explosive atmospheres and how we classify those areas. 10-1 looks at gas and vapors, and 10-2 looks at dust, fibers, or flyings. There are other codes of practice out there. For example, some people might be familiar with the EI, or as they used to be, IP15 code of practice, or there's the IGEM SR25, Institute of Gas Engineering Managers, which SR25, which is all about natural gas installations. Or people may be familiar with the APIA book, which we'll talk about in a minute, and we'll show you some examples of that, which refer to fuel forecourts. Just a couple of examples there. In the background, you'll see, and people will be very familiar with those large sort of processing sites, be it refinery or chemical processing. My background itself, I've come from, it doesn't exist anymore, from ICI, from a large chemical processing site where pretty much, you know, a significant proportion of the site was given over to explosive atmospheres just through the nature of the materials that was either stored or processed on that site. So you can see there we've got example in the background, you say, of that large sort of site. But what about other areas? Well, first of all, I just want to draw your attention to the bottom left where you've got that EX in the triangle. That is the signage that is a legal requirement and is used to designate areas which do contain explosive atmospheres. So ideally they're posted at the entrance points or at the gate and going into these areas. The location really is subject to the risk assessment that may be pertinent to the site. But ultimately that is the signage. It tells you you'll be walking into a location or area which is, from our point of view, deemed hazardous. Just a couple of examples you can see there. We've got examples of a pharmaceutical. You will obviously clearly be familiar with fuel forecourts. We've also got an example there of a water utilities, water treatment site, again, where you've got, you can have methane through obviously digestion of obviously slurry, etc. You can even have combustible dust hazards depending on what's going on. If you look at food and beverage, I've just got an example there of a whiskey distillery, and people may be familiar with the term Angel's Share, if you've ever had a tour around a distillery. But what about other areas? You know, even somewhere as innocuous as a wood, obviously you can see there, that even in areas where you've got significant deposits of wood dust, they can lead to explosive atmospheres. Or even there, I think just a couple of silos that I think it could be something like grain or something like that. But again, if these areas have got small particles, okay, and under test they've been found to be combustible, then these areas will be hazardous from a point of view of potentially explosive atmosphere. So these are areas that we do need to be concerned about, and it obviously should alter our behaviour and what we do in these locations. We mentioned a minute ago about zones and hazardous areas. These are the zones that we talk about. Okay, so we've got zone 0 or zone 20, zone 1 or zone 21, and zone 2 or zone 22. Zone 0 or 20, this is the area, or I suppose the most hazardous in terms, because it's explosive atmosphere where it's present continuously or long periods or frequently. Zone 1 or 21 is where it's expected to be present in normal operation occasionally. And finally, the least hazardous, zone 2 or 22, where it's not likely to be occur in normal operation, but if it does, it will only persist for a short period. Now, given the fact we've got that zone 0, 21, 21, 2, 22, it stands to reason that the equipment in those areas should have the right level of protection, such that it recognises the dangers of being in that area. So when we look at, say, a zone 0 or 20, there's certain types of equipment we can allow. And when I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we talk about ATEX categories. Okay, these is where the categories come in. And if you come on a CompEx course or you do some further reading, you'll realise the link between the categories and the zones of use. Okay. Again, if you've had experience of these locations and you've seen what we call a hazardous area classification drawing, and I'll show you some examples in a minute, you'll see that they will have a symbol key on there, okay? And they will clearly define the zones that are displayed on that drawing. So you'll typically get a drawing maybe in side and plan elevation, or even now 3-dimensional. And the idea is that what it will do is portray the zones within that location such that you can then make the right selection in terms of the equipment. And once you've made the right selection, then obviously you can make sure that you install that equipment correctly. It will also ensure that when you're working in those areas, you're working safely against a set of rules, and we'll talk about permit to work and hot work, etc. later on. Ultimately, also, you've got to make sure that you take note of these symbols. There are other information as well, which we'll talk about in a minute, but ultimately this information is absolutely key to ensure that you can work safely in these locations. If you just look there, I've just a couple of examples of some zones, and this is actually taken from, or courtesy of, the APIA book, the Association of Petroleum Explosive Atmospheres Administration. And this is looking, for those who are familiar with the term, it's the Blue Book, currently in its 4th edition. And I've just got a couple of examples from that publication just to show you, because you'll be familiar with some of these environments. So these are obviously, if you look there at the top middle, what you've got there is fuel forecourt, and you'll have seen them when you go to drive onto a fuel forecourt. You'll have seen some sort of tank vents. Typically the tanks are underground, but actually there is a hazardous area or a zoned area around the vent tips within that sort of environment. Clearly, many have been frustrated when you've rocked up to a fuel forecourt, and obviously the tank is in, so you can't drive in. Well, there is a reason why, because obviously they're offloading a petroleum liquid, and clearly, as you can see there, as a result of the offloading, then it actually does create a localized zone around the apron, obviously, of where that tanker is. So you can understand why you can't go into those areas. At the bottom there, you'll see just an example there of a below ground storage tank. The inside the tank itself is classified as a zone 0. We are expecting a hazardous area to be there permanently, or certainly for long periods. And then we've got example there of a zone 1, which is around the obviously the connection point, and a zone 2, depending on what type of filling you're doing. But you can see there, as I say, that clearly even something is on a fuel forecourt, there are zones. You take this sort of drawing and the principles behind this drawing, and you can certainly see, you know, you apply this principle to a large refinery or chemical site, or even something like a small storage facility. So again, some of you will be familiar with working in maybe in a small chemical yard, or even just a plain storage facility, okay, where it stores flammable materials. If you're in a room where you're storing flammable materials, then guess what? Yeah, it's likely to be a zoned area. If it's zoned area, then again, there'll be the requirements for installing certain types of equipment in those areas to make sure that area remains safe. And we'll talk about these now. So from tragic beginnings, really, we are where we are today with what we call our equipment concepts. So if we go back several hundred years ago, where was the term hazardous areas? Where were they? Well, they were largely down the mines, down the coal mines. The term fireman actually comes from the person, the unlucky person, should I say, who was sent down the mine shaft, doused in wet rags, and was sent there to deliberately ignite the methane that was coming out the coal face. So they went down with a some sort of obviously ignition on the end of a very long pole, and they deliberately ignited the methane. And then once the methane was ignited, the miners could work safely, in inverted commas. Clearly, that wasn't necessarily safe, and as we progressed into the Industrial Revolution and we relied more and more on coal, then clearly there was accidents that were happening. And so Humphrey Davy came up with the first sort of device, which was the Davy lamp, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, where you've got a simple wire gauze. It allows the flammable gas to get in, but does not allow the flame out to ignite the external atmosphere. And that was the first real true, I suppose, concept of where we can allow an ignition source safely into an area. The bottom left there, some of you may be familiar with a big, heavy, robust cast iron piece of equipment, which was flame proof, or FLP at the time. It's now called EXD, and that was really the first true protection concept. Back in 1913 in the Sengened colliery, South Wales, apologies if not pronounced that correctly, there was an explosion and 440 men and boys were killed. And what the illustration on the bottom right there is illustrating is what they thought was they had a signaling system, and to get an alarm bell to go to signal up on the surface, then you just put a short across with a shovel across 2 wires. It might create a spark, but it was thought that spark didn't have enough energy to ignite the atmosphere. However, it was connected to a bell where it had induction, and therefore it was an inductive spark that created the explosion. And obviously, in this case, unfortunately, 440 men and boys were killed. And this came about, they actually came out a second concept, really, which was what we call intrinsic safety. But I say from where we were to where we are now, we've got a huge range of equipment we can select against a range of equipment concepts. So you'll see there we've got things like EXQ, EXO, EXI, EXNR, EXD. These are all protection concepts that are applied to items of equipment through the design by a manufacturer, and then they are what we would call certified by a certification body, so they are indeed safe to use in these areas. Effectively, they possess special features that are specifically designed to render them suitable for use in these explosive atmospheres. However, and there's a big however, the equipment is only as good as, first of all, ensuring it is selected correctly for the zone it is going into. Secondly, that the design that is apportioned to the installation or the equipment is correct, and the equipment is installed correctly, it is maintained correctly, and it is inspected to ensure that its ongoing suitability is, and it's fit for purpose for use in these areas. And it's really, I suppose, the issue of, why, and by the way, the equipment is more expensive than you will find in a non-hazardous area. So why go through the pain and the expense of spending this money if actually we compromise the installation through poor design or poor installation or poor ongoing maintenance and inspection? So it's absolutely critical we look at the complete sort of end-to-end life cycle of this equipment to ensure it is, as I say, designed correctly, installed correctly, and ultimately, say, it's maintained and inspected to ensure its ongoing suitability. When we talk about CompEx, and we'll talk about that later on, we will get to the heart of many of these concepts and some of the key things that you will need to do and not to do when you're dealing with this equipment. But as I say, you can see there, there's quite a significant range of equipment there, which you can select, provided it's got the right concepts and categories we mentioned before, and ensure that they're safe for use within these locations. So what information do I need if I'm working in these locations? Well, we do work against standards. I mentioned before some of the standards in relation to area classification. We've got some standards there which, from the point of view of installation or selection, design and installation, that's IEC or BSEN, in this case 60079 Part 14, and 60079 Part 17 refers to inspection and maintenance. They're very much key, and obviously we refer to those. They are really, I suppose, our key standards in relation to what we deal with in relation to CompEx. Okay, it's important to note that, by the way, that these standards are in addition to those for non-hazardous areas, i.e. or locations, i.e. BS 7671 or the wiring regulations. From a point of view, what other information is out there? I've just mentioned a couple there. There's a EMEWA 186, which is the practitioner's handbook, and we'll talk about that later on, and EMEWA 214, or the toolbox guide, which is given to every candidate who attends a CompEx course. And I'll talk about both those publications in a little bit more detail later on. So we've got the standards, we've got the guidance that we need. Okay, well, clearly we need details of the hazardous area classification, i.e. the location that we're going to work in. So we need to have a drawing that shows the location, the type of zone, and we give a few examples before. You also need to know things like the gas or dust subdivision, the temperature classification for these areas or location. And again, these terms will mean something to you if you've been on a CompEx course or you do a bit of research. And I say, but ultimately, all this is explained when you come on a CompEx course. You also, if in case of dust hazards, you might have characteristics, but if you're dealing with a dust cloud or layers, and again, all this is explained on the CompEx courses. You will also need to know details of any environmental factors, for example, the ingress protection for a particular environment, ambient or process temperatures, is it a corrosive environment? All of these factors will play a part into ensuring that you or someone has selected the correct equipment to go into these locations. So what about the project specification? Well, ultimately, it could be, and again, subject to the scope of work that you're working under, it might be the responsibility of the site owner operator to provide you this information, or you may be providing the information yourself. But you will need things like equipment specifications, manufacturer's installation operation manual, obviously, to know how to install the equipment correctly, the equipment declaration of conformity, which is your legal statement provided by the equipment manufacturer that states obviously this equipment meets the various standards to ensure that it is safe to go into these locations. For those who are familiar with the EX certificates, or might have seen ATEX or ICX certificates, especially if the certificates contain what we call a suffix X, which means they have special or specific conditions of safe use, so it's important to read these certificates. If you're dealing with IS systems or intrinsic safety systems, then you will need things like descriptive system documents, or wiring schedules, circuit information identification, cable schedules, designated cable entry systems, any details of previous records of inspections, etc. All this information you will need certainly to make sure that you install the equipment safely. But what should I need to hand over? Obviously, at the end of a particular project, again, subject to the scope of work, you will hand over what we call the verification dossier. Again, subject to the scope, you may be handing details of the hazardous area classification information. This is obviously to the end user or the site owner. You'll be providing them details of the equipment that has been installed. We call it the equipment asset or the EX register. You're providing the manufacturer documentation that you've collated as part of that installation. Again, equipment declarations of conformity, EX certificates, descriptive system documents, as I said before, or DSDs, the wiring drawings, information, cable schedules, test reports, records of that initial inspection. So it's not only just a case of installing the equipment. What you then, at the end of that installation phase, I suppose as prior to or as part of the commissioning phase, you undertake what we call an initial inspection, and that's against the standard 60079 part 17. And that, from our point of view, is a detailed check that ensures that the installation is indeed safe, everything's been installed correctly, and that's that final sign off from a point of view to say, yeah, okay, it's all good, and obviously ultimately we can power up. But I must stress, okay, you must carry out that initial inspection as part of that activity. From a point of view, talk to HSE, it's an absolute must that the initial inspection must be done. Also, it goes without saying that whilst all this work has been taking place, it goes without saying that the qualifications of the individuals that have either undertaken the design, the installation, or indeed the inspection must be provided as part of that overall record of competency that goes to the site owner operator, because ultimately that's their check, you know, in 5 or 10 years time that there's proof that the equipment was installed by people who were deemed competent. Okay, and we'll talk about that shortly. But you can see there's a raft of information that is needed, and again, it's just obviously highlighting the fact that the importance of this documentation that is provided as part of the handover at the end of the job.
Just a very quick point, Paul, it might be worth noting that inspection that you speak of at the end should not be confused with an EICR or an electrical installation inspection, just to make that point.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Alan. Yeah, this is a separate set of inspections that purely looks at those aspects that are there from a point of view of the equipment and it being installed in explosive atmospheres. So we talked before about, for example, a flame-proof piece of equipment. It's flame-proof and it's a concept. So when we look at the checks that are required against that initial inspection, there are certain checks that cover the concept flame-proof to ensure that we haven't got things like we haven't compromised flame paths, etc. And again, I'm using terms you might not be familiar with, but I said it will all become clear if you did come on a CompEx course or you decide to do some further research. Well, thank you, Alan. Also, it's just a bit about the fact that even just working in these areas, you could introduce danger. And again, I think everybody's aware that, you know, if you don't ask the right questions, and clearly a permit to work on its own does not make the area or the task safe. So you've got obviously that dialogue with the site owner operator and the permit to work issuer. You know, you need to make sure you've got the correct information. You need to make sure that you take note of the signage in those areas, the area classification drawings, etc. Ultimately, if you don't, you could unwittingly introduce an ignition source into these locations, what we would basically call, you know, you could introduce a hot work, and clearly introducing an ignition source into an area with potentially flammable atmospheres, well, you can imagine the potential consequences. So it goes out to say, you know, we've really got to be smart here in terms of working, and obviously knowing our limitations within the working area, and ultimately obviously keeping lines of communication open and making sure we've got that correct dialogue with the permit to work issuer. Clearly, obviously, you know, people have got to have the right level of training to recognize some of these hazards. You know, yeah, okay, people might not be aware, but ignorance is not a defense. So, you know, making sure you got the right awareness, you got the right training, okay. And also, you know, if you're not competent, then clearly you could introduce danger into the workplace. So being competent to perform the tasks you've been asked to perform obviously ensures that you are working safely. And I can't stress enough the fact that, you know, people have to be competent to work in these locations against some of the aspects that we've talked about previously. Just a little bit there, I mean, just to illustrate where we're coming from, you know, even something as simple as, I say, the bottom right hand side there, that is a representation of a label on something as simple and innocuous as a junction box. But clearly you see some coding there that might not mean anything to you, but if you're working in these hazardous areas, it should do. Okay, so you know, we've got there where we see the top, it says Roman numeral 22GD. Well, the 2GD, that is our category. Okay, so then we've got the concept below that, or concepts, the ambient temperature you can work in, the ingress protection. We've got some of the certificates I spoke to you before about, and the X at the end means, well, yes, we've got to look at the certificate and see what it means. So all this information will mean something, or should mean something to you if you are working in these areas. If you're installing this equipment, then even things like cable glands, you must select the right cable glands for use against the equipment and the location. You must select the right cable. You've got to install these cable glands, the equipment, and terminate it all correctly. And all this is part of the installation sequence that you will do to, and obviously perform safely and correctly to ensure you're not introducing danger or ignition source. And on the bottom left there, you can see that, you know, that you've got the character there shaking the head. You know, it can be quite complex, the marking, even on equipment. So again, you've got to be able to understand the equipment and what it means to be able to install it correctly. So it's, you know, as you can see, it can be complicated, but the idea of the likes of CompEx is to, I suppose, lift the mist. Okay, so you can work safely in these locations by knowing some of the key information that is required to work safely. A bit about CompEx and where we've come on and where does it fit in. Well, CompEx came about in terms of from tragedy, okay, going back to the 6th of July 1988 and the Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea, which killed 167 workers. And as a result of the Lord Cullen inquiry into that disaster, it had over 100 recommendations, and one of them, or several of recommendations, looked at competency of working in these areas, and the CompEx scheme was born out of this Lord Cullen report and the disaster which Piper Alpha. CompEx has been going since 1994 with the first centre opening in Aberdeen, and today there's around 30,000 individuals across the world. CompEx isn't just a UK scheme, it's a truly international scheme, and over 30,000 individuals are certified under the terms of the CompEx certification scheme. We do offer a range of qualifications, I'll talk about them in a minute, that looks at electrical, mechanical, supervisory, engineers, the range of roles that you typically find on a site. And the training, I say, is delivered via our international and national approved training providers, they are licensed to deliver, and we've got approximately 60 across the world. Okay. Now, despite Piper Alpha, obviously, you know, going in 1988, well, we still have incidents today, and we've just got a range of incidents. Obviously, just against a timeline there, you know, people may be familiar with things like Deepwater Horizon out in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Texas. In 2010, people I'm sure would have seen the pictures of the major oil spill. But let's not forget, whilst the pollution and all that and all the damage that caused the environment, you know, was headlines, 11 people were killed at when obviously the initial explosion. Closer to home on some of the, I know I've got the timeline there, but closer to home, people will be familiar hopefully with things like Buncefield. Happened in 2005. There was the Bosley Mill explosion in 2015, and more recently 2020 there was the Avonmouth explosion, and both the Bosley Mill and the Avonmouth explosion did result in fatalities. Interestingly, when I was putting some of this together the other day, I did come across a UK government source which looked at fire and rescue data, and in 2021, this is from the government data provided, there were 268 recorded instances of a fire resulting from a gas release and subsequent explosion, and of those 268 incidents, there were 93 recorded casualties and fatalities. So that's quite recent, obviously 2021. So, you know, despite our best efforts, you know, these incidents still do occur, and obviously the purpose of today obviously is to raise people's awareness, obviously to contribute to make sure that we can work as safely as we can in these locations. So I say, when we're looking at the qualifications that are offered by CompEx, you can see there we've got a huge range of qualifications that cover a range of disciplines, everything from the manager, or we term the responsible person. So you might have heard the term duty holder. Okay, so they're the persons in the top, they're the persons who make the decisions. So we have a course that's designed for them to raise the awareness and give them a level of understanding and competency so they can ensure that they can make the right decisions. In terms of designing the installations that go into these hazardous areas, we have a module called EX12. I'll skip the advanced practitioner for a second. We then have a range of modules that are designed for a range of activities and roles. So EX 1 to 4 is for EC&I personnel working in explosive gas atmospheres. EX 5 and 6, that is for EC&I personnel working in explosive dust atmospheres. EX 7 and 8 is centered purely around fuel forecourts, and 9 and 10 is focused on the water industry. EX 11 it looks at the mechanical people working in those locations, because whilst a lot of people recognize that maybe an electric motor could present an ignition source, that motor might be connected to a pump or a fan, and guess what? Yeah, even that mechanical piece of equipment again could present an ignition source, depending on the type of equipment it was, you know, through things like friction, if say a bearing was to collapse or something like that. We have an advanced practitioner. So for those who've achieved the core practitioner, then we do have a recognized practitioner program for those individuals who are looking to extend their competency beyond what we basically say is a maximum period of 5 years. So if we get a CompEx certificate, it'll be valid for a maximum period of 5 years. So within that 5-year period, you should come back to be refreshed. That 5-year period is based on the standards. We haven't just made it. And again, it's something that, you know, if you want to maintain your competency, if your employer wants to maintain your competency, then you obviously got to have it refreshed as a minimum every 5 years. Okay. And ultimately, what does competency deliver? It looks at your knowledge and it looks at your skills. Okay. We can't deal with experience necessarily, but clearly, you know, that comes part of your CPD that you may have with your employer, etc. And I'll talk about CPD in a minute. And finally, at the very bottom there, as a general, and you might find that maybe for general workers or as a good lead-in for people who are really quite green to the subject, you might find it beneficial to do a foundation or a foundation plus, or we have a e-learning module called Safe Behaviours. You might find that useful to do as a lead-in to something like EX 1 to 4, especially if you're new to the subject. Okay, it's very much down to yourselves, but say if you're, you know, by all means, please talk to our centres, please talk to us, you know, but ultimately, if you do find that you're completely green to this, then it might be beneficial for you to do some sort of pre-course like the foundation prior to jumping into something like 1 to 4, or even 12 or 14. But again, it's very much based on your levels of understanding. So, but ultimately, what about the future? Where are we going with competency? Well, what CompEx are working on at the moment is we're working on a new platform called Leader. Okay, and this is going to be our CompEx management system, or sorry, learner management system, and it enables learner programs to be tailored towards specific needs. And I say we're going to have a number of programs that are available via our portal. Okay, so you'll be able to, if you come on a CompEx course, you will be able to have access to a range of programs that will either help prepare you for a course or ultimately give you some information post-course. Okay, and this is some of the innovation that we're working on now, and ultimately making that information readily accessible to our network of obviously employers and employees, and ultimately candidates who are coming on our course. So this is new, completely new to CompEx, and it is going to be rolled out over the coming months and years as we progress. But this is where we're going in relation to providing that level of innovation to support our learners. Just a little bit about e-learning. You know, COVID, I suppose, has accelerated the desire for distance learning. And one of the things that we're looking at here is that we do have e-learning, and it's become really quite a crucial part of an employer's sort of training and development for their employers. And it is clear from some of the feedback that we've got that there's a definite desire for e-learning, and it's you know, and they do, and from surveys we have taken place, it's a significant role in managing competency. And I say it enhances the practical training and assessment delivered by our a network of licensed training assessment providers. So it is there, you know, and we're looking at more and more to develop it even further to enhance the learning experience of the learners who come onto our qualifications. In terms of publications, I'm conscious of time. Then, as you can see there, we've got a range of publications on offer. I mentioned before about the Toolbox Guide, and there's a practitioner's handbook there on the top left. These are publications that are available, and for those who are interested, the Toolbox Guide is actually available as a free app. Okay, if people are interested, you can go to the App Store or Google Play, and as you search CompEx Toolbox Guide, you will find that you can download it onto your phone for free, or your device. Okay, well, I would say clearly, you know, these devices cannot be taken into a hazardous area. It goes without saying, and actually there's a disclaimer on the front. But ultimately, you can see there that again we've tried to make it as accessible as possible. Again, as part of and I'll touch a minute about our website. You know, we're looking at white papers, providing more information, technical briefings. I say we've developed the app, just providing that enriched sort of information environment for the benefit of our alumni and the candidates who are coming and undertaking the qualifications that we have. So the information's there, and I say by all means, if you go onto our website, and I'll show that our website in a minute, I say a lot of this information is there. Okay. So if you go onto compexcertification.com, our website, you will find a whole host of information. If you look at the top right there, you'll see the CompEx store. So there is things you can purchase, things like we've got some of the e-learning courses I've mentioned they're available on there. But ultimately, you know, there's a lot of information. You know, if you look at the banners there about industry, about our qualifications, information about centres, by the way. So if you're looking for a centre, click on the centres link up there, and obviously you'll be able to find a centre nearest to you. And obviously including what qualifications they offer. There's a whole host of news and blogs, and I say, you know, we've provided some white papers and trying to provide that information to the network, as in to obviously promote safety in the workplace. But there's a huge amount of information on our website, so please do I definitely advocate having a look and seeing what information is on there. So if you're not sure about what qualifications to do, then clearly again there is information on the qualifications that we offer. Again, I would encourage you either, if you're still not sure, to talk to your local centre, or you can talk to us if you're not quite sure of what qualification sits for your role and responsibility. But there's a lot of information there for you to look at. And finally, obviously we've got there, please, you know, we've got contact information. You can contact us at info@compex-cert.com, or alternatively, you can follow us on social media. We went our Facebook page or LinkedIn or Twitter. So again, you know, we do keep the information that we do post, you know, up to date. So again, please do join this social media, and again, I'll look out for the information that we do post. So you know, we're trying to basically say, you know, there's quite a lot of means, you know, through website or social media, or just purely contacting via the info at. You know, there's various ways you can keep abreast of the information. And I say, and it's our intention to make sure that the information is kept, you know, live, current, and up to date. Okay, I think that probably gives us about 10-15 minutes for questions, Gary. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
No, that's brilliant. Cheers for that, Paul. Most appreciated. I suppose a couple of things I take away from that is the first thing is 7671 is just one tool in the toolbox. There's other standards you mentioned about the APA Blue Book and the 60079 series. People working in potentially hazardous areas shouldn't just focus on 7671. And the other thing is competency is key, and people should be very cautious, rightly so, and shouldn't put themselves at risk at any point in that. We've got a couple of questions come through. Do you want to share them between yourselves? Alan's had an easy gig this afternoon. He's had a lovely afternoon. I can just sort of throw them out and see what you guys think. First one is, are there any insurance requirements that contractors need to be aware of? I'm guessing that means when transferring or transitioning into a hazardous area.
Do you want me to answer that, Alan?
You go ahead, Paul. Yep, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if you're working within these locations, it goes out saying you do need to let your insurers know, because obviously, ultimately, it might not be covered under your scope within your insurance. So if you're going to obviously undertake this work, you at the very least need to have that level of that conversation with your insurer to ensure that you've got the adequate insurance in place. But the only thing I'd strongly advocate is clearly talk to your insurer to see what scope you're working under.
Well, another question that came in is, do you have any taster type courses? Any things that people can just check out?
We do have a intro EX, which is on our website. Perhaps we can share that link, Gary, I think. So
possibly, yeah, but we could.
Yeah, well, yeah. So we do have what we call intro EX, which is a bit of a taste. I think it's about I think it's 15-20 minutes. It's a short sort of e-learning piece. There's a little bit of interaction in there, but it just gives an insight into what explosive atmospheres are, and I say a bit of information about CompEx. So it might be something that I think we do find that, or feedback from ECA members is one of the problems they've had is they've worked in locations where actually they know more than the site owner operator. So again, it might be something that they could share with the owner operator to raise awareness.
Brilliant. Question coming from Chris. I'll not read it out, but no, it's not a sparkly shirt. It's just an ordinary t-shirt. A question from Neil, which is, can you repeat the reference for the HSE approved code of practice, please? I'm guessing that was back on slide 3, 4.
Yeah, it's ACOP L138, Lima 138.
L138. Hopefully you've got that, Neil. If not, drop an email through to technical@eca.co.uk and we can pass the info on.
That is free to download, Gary, remember, from the HSE's website as well.
Oh, anything that's free is always good, isn't it? Anything that's free. Looking forward to the webinar. Cheers, Nick. Another question from Nick. Nothing about NEC?
Say that again, sorry.
Nothing about NEC, November Echo Charlie.
The NEC, are we talking about the NEC codes now, North American code?
I don't think so. Nick, if you want to just drop a question back in and expand on that, then we'll pick up on that one. Question from Joe. This was a good one. What precautions can someone take when doing work, such as repairing a piece of equipment, in an area that has not been assessed, does not have any notices or zoning classification drawings, but the area is known to contain combustibles such as gas or solvents? What do people do at that stage? What do they do? What's their stop and have a think?
It really is that, Gary, to vary. It's really stop, have a think. Really should be going back to the site owner. By the sounds of it, I say it's not unique where they say the contractor working in the area knows more than the owner of the location. Let's put it that way. But ultimately, I suppose if you're working in that area that, you know, I suppose what you don't want to do is introduce further hazards, do you? So, you know, I'm trying to think of an example where the scope of supply might be install. I had a phone call from a individual who's an ECA member, and his concerns were he was working in a location, I think it was a below ground inspection pit, where there was fuel around, and he was being asked to install basically standard metal clad sockets, bulkhead lights, etc. And he was like, and he expressed his concern, and clearly I said, well, you know, at the end of the day, you've got to go to the owner of the site and say clearly, you know, I believe there's a danger here, and obviously highlight that danger to the owner operators so they can take the appropriate action. But ultimately, he did the right thing, and he didn't proceed until he obviously highlighted the issues to the site owner. So I think this instance was the site owner operator; they were completely oblivious, you know. So, but ignorance is not a defence, is it?
No, absolutely not. I suppose you can always go back and ask for a hazardous area risk assessment to be done, and that at that point, then you know what the risks are. I mean, a lot of our members will be familiar with zones around baths or swimming pools or the likes, but the zones in a hazardous area can be a slightly different concept, but I suppose the practice is the same. Question from Nigel: will Leader, the learning management system you mentioned earlier, will it be available to those already CompEx qualified in the industry?
We will be looking at eventually rolling it out to our network of alumni. So the short answer will be there will be some, and I think Alan, you can probably say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so it is just as we've mentioned, just a relatively new concept and platform for CompEx. The initial intention is to roll it out to new people who are enrolling on a CompEx qualification, and we're at the early stage of planning and resourcing, but certainly based on, you know, feedback from industry, we as Paul mentioned, we have a number of alumni who are people who hold an existing in-date CompEx certificate, and I'm sure we'll all be aware of what we call a skills fade, or the forgetting curve. And a CompEx certificate lasts for 5 years, so if you do not keep your skills up to date or don't continue to you know, be aware of the risks, or you know, are working in that industry, then you will in some cases likely forget more than you remember. So we understand there is a call from it. It is a really good question. It's good to hear that people are looking for it that are already certificated. So it will be something that is coming soon. We are just at the early stages of the rollout, so unfortunately today I can't give you a time frame on that, but it will be coming at an appropriate time. It would be interesting to see the person to see if they have already had an email from CompEx. We are looking to get in touch with everyone who has a certificate to ask these sort of questions. So if not, please get in touch and we'll give some information to him.
Well,
or them.
Lovely. And final question, it's a bit of a tricky one. I don't want to put you on the spot. From Ruth: do you have any past papers which can be offered to students? Also, most of the students ask to receive feedback on what and where they've gone wrong in online exams. Is this something that we can start receiving? I guess it's somebody who's done some training and just wants to know a bit more about where they could improve when doing the exams.
You want me to answer that, Alan, or do you want to?
I can just very quickly introduce that as part of the Leader rollout, we are just at the early stages of that development. So we've got some sample questions, just a very short sample to give people a bit of an idea around what the type of question and wording and content would look like. We are in development to try and create a past paper or something like that that will become the official CompEx sample exam. Some local training providers do offer some support in that area, but we are looking to sort of design one ourselves. Again, we're at the early stages of this development. Don't mean to say that again, but it will be coming soon. Paul, you can extend a little on that.
And yeah. Final question. I mentioned it already. I think Paul mentioned it. If people want to get in touch with CompEx, how do they do that?
Yes, if you go on to the info@compex-cert.com, I can flash that up again if you want it just in a second, but yeah, if you can obviously email us, or you say you can contact us through social media as well, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. Just to pick up on a point, Gary, also about feedback. That's something in terms of people's performance in any exam. That is something we are looking at, as well as what we can do. And we do provide some feedback on some of our qualifications, but not all at the moment. And it is something, again, we are looking to do. But people have got to, I suppose, realise that there's a careful balance between obviously providing too much information, but also providing enough information so people know where they go wrong. So yeah, but there's a fine balance, but it's something that we are looking at. And
usually your local training provider should give you a level of feedback that should be acceptable. But certainly, as Paul said, it's something we're looking at to extend the scope of that.
Right, I think, let me just have one more quick check, and I think that should be it for the questions. Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Alan, for your time there. I hope you guys at home enjoyed that and found it useful. And if you did, if you want to get in touch with the guys at CompEx or ask any questions, feel free to, or get in touch with ECA, technical@eca.co.uk. We'll hopefully chat to you then. Other than that, thanks ever so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.